Welcome. So today's webinar is Etiquette Today and examining its role in today's job search. I'm your host, Maria Kim. I'm the Career and Industry Coordinator here for Penn State School of Hospitality Management. And joining us is Dr. Toos, an Associate Professor for the School of Hospitality Management. Good morning.
Good morning, Maria, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to be here on a bright, sunny Wednesday morning.
And also joining us, Jason Viona. His title's quite a little long. I've been working on this. So Jason Viona is a current PSHRS president and the Senior Director of Talent Acquisition and University Relations at Marriott International. Woo, how'd I do?
Very nice. Good morning, Jason.
Good morning, Jason.
Good morning, and thank you for having me today.
So Jason is joining us from, where are you at this morning, Jason?
I'm actually at the W Bellevue. It just opened up about 3 weeks ago.
Okay, very good. And it is 7 o'clock your time, so we thank you for being up bright and early.
My pleasure.
All right, so the webinar today, we've titled it Etiquette Today, Examining Its Role in Today's Job Search. So it's all about recruiting etiquette. What matters, what doesn't matter, what impact does it have on people's job search success? So the game plan for this morning is threefold. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about research, a little bit of an academic perspective. Then Jason is going to add his practitioner perspective. Then we'll have a chance for formal Q&A near the end of the webinar. But if anyone out there has any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to ask them. Type it in your screen, and we will be happy to answer them. So regarding the research, I want to answer 3 different questions for us. 1, how much do recruiters value different etiquette practices? Number 2, does etiquette, how the candidate behaves during the interview process, does that actually impact whether or not they get a job offer or not? And the third thing I want to talk about is there still that darn tattoo bias? All right, so let's get rocking and rolling with the research.
Why do you think it's really important?
So why do we have to talk about etiquette? Why is etiquette important? First, it's just a good thing to do. It signals courtesy and respect. If you take the opportunity to talk to me as an interviewee, you being the interviewer, it's a good thing for me to do. Also, it may be a signal of my personality and how I may fit with the job and the organization. And where it's a little bit of a challenge these days is that society is becoming more informal. And when society becomes more informal, the workplace is becoming more informal. And those darn millennials, as much as we love them, they value self-expression and they're less apt to adhere to the rules to some degree. So we're kind of evolving regarding etiquette. So it's important to figure out where are we at this current point in time. Okay. All right, so research question number 1. What etiquette is valued by recruiters? So I teach interviewing etiquette to our students here in the school. And inevitably, when I tell them the do's and don'ts, we engage in a little bit of a debate. I'll say, keep your cell phone out of sight, and they'll say, but Dr. Toos,
I need to Snapchat you.
I need to Snapchat during the interview. Or I'll say, send a handwritten thank you note, and they'll say, I don't want to, I could just send an email note. I'll say, bring a copy of your resume to the interviewer, and they'll say, I don't need to because, I've already sent it to them electronically. The interviewer may already have it. So when we have these discussions, I tell them this is my opinion, and a lot of pros have said you should do these things, but we really have limited data. So I thought, why not ask recruiters what they think? How important is each of these things? So on the screen, we have 12 etiquette practices. 1, addressing interviewers by their formal titles when first meeting folks.
Good morning, Dr. Toos.
Good morning, Ms. Kim. It's a pleasure to meet you. Bringing the extra copy of the resume, exchanging business cards, dressing formally and conservatively, not smelling of cigarette smoke, refraining from exhibiting tattoos, carrying a briefcase, notepad or portfolio to the interview, the proper handshake, keeping cell phone out of sight, thanking you at the end of the interview, and then we have thank you notes. So of these 12, Maria, without knowing the data, what do you think is probably most important and what do you think is least important? Based on what the recruiters told us.
Well, probably addressing interviewers by formal titles. For me, that is very important.
Okay.
Maybe the least important, refraining from exhibiting tattoos.
All right, so let's have a little drum roll. Come on. Okay, now let's look at the results. So we had about 150 recruiters, and we asked them on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being very important, 1 being not at all important, how relevant is each of the practices? So at the top of the list, cell phone, off, and out of sight.
Okay.
You know, it's kind of interesting because, you know, some students say, you know, as long as it's off, I can have it in front of me. But recruiters are saying, keep it far out of sight. Then at the bottom of the list, the business cards. What is interesting is that 5 of the items were rated as being very important. So they had scores above 4. Only 2 of the items were rated less than 3, the handwritten note and the business cards. And it looks like about 5 of them were in the mid-range. The briefcase, the extra copies of the resumes, the not showing the tattoos, the email note, and the formal titles. Now, items 6 through 10 on there, a lot of times the students say, you know what, I don't need to do those. But the data there is saying, you know what, they may not be the most important, but we still need to do them.
What's important to you? A thank you note from an email or a nice personal touch handwritten note with maybe like pineapples on it?
All right, so for me personally, you know, I'm expecting the email note within 24 hours, but also I do like the handwritten note. Interestingly, on there, the handwritten note was only rated 2.29, but I'd like to draw your attention to the second column. Those are the agreement scores.
Oh,
those agreement scores say how consistent were the recruiters in their responses. So even though the handwritten note was rated fairly low rather, its agreement was low. So that means there were still a number of people who said, you know what, I do value that.
Wow.
And also I also looked at differences by age, and older recruiters valued the handwritten note particularly. They also valued being referred to by their formal titles.
The old school way.
So that signals that, you know, the students really need to pay attention to adhering to the formal rules,
right,
particularly when interacting with older individuals.
Very nice.
So armed with this information, we can tell our students, you know, these things matter, and some other things may be a little more context dependent. All right, so we do have a question up there. What does that say, Maria?
Does etiquette predict a job search success?
All right, I asked, is there a question on screen?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Ryan, we will be sending you a recording of this so you can share it with your members.
And also, we will send you the slide deck should you wish that. We'd be more than happy to share that with you. All right, so now we can go back to the slide. Do you want to read that, Maria?
So does etiquette really matter?
Okay, so the next question is, when students follow these practices, does it predict whether or not they'll be successful in their job search?
Okay.
So with a sample of 155 graduating seniors, we looked at the extent to which they engaged in the etiquette practices,
Mhm.
and then we asked them how much work experience they had, their GPA, the extent to which they were involved in various organizations, and whether or not they engaged in other impression management strategies, ingratiation and self-promotion.
What does that mean?
Ingratiation is complimenting the interviewer and the organization. So, you look very good today,
Oh, thank you.
and you work for a wonderful organization. And then self-promotion is really assertively and aggressively talking about your credentials. Previous research has shown that each of these 5 things matters. So I wanted to look at, not only does etiquette actually predict number of job offers, but how much does it matter relative to these other things that we know tend to work. All right, so now let's look at the results. So anything with a star was demonstrated to be a significant predictor of number of job offers.
Job offers.
So etiquette mattered. And how we measured etiquette, we asked students, to what extent did you engage in each of the 12 things
Okay.
that we talked about before, and we created an average score.
Mm-hmm.
Those who tended to engage in all of those things on average received more job offers. So that was good from an etiquette perspective. Work experience, not surprisingly, that had a significant impact. And what we asked was the number of jobs that they had. We didn't look at the quality of work. We can do that in the future.
Right.
But for purposes of this, we just looked at number of positions. GPA mattered.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And sometimes we have students who say, GPA doesn't matter. But we did find that those with a higher GPA did tend to have more job offers. Regarding involvement, we asked about student clubs, recreational activities, such as being in a music group on campus, theater group, or involved in athletics. Then community service and volunteering. Of the 3 involvement things,
Mm-hmm.
only the recreational activities predicted whether or not they had more offers or not.
Really? So if I'm like in a theater group here, that would actually be a good thing for me.
Correct. Now, I always scratch my head when I look at these findings trying to interpret them.
Right.
And I was thinking, why does that matter relative to the other things?
Yeah.
And I think it may serve to differentiate candidates. When we're going through the resumes, students that have some, outside interests,
Right.
outside of pure academics, the recruiters are probably thinking, what, that person may be more well-rounded.
Mm-hmm.
And also that person can probably engage in more dialogue throughout the interview. Interestingly, the student clubs didn't matter or not.
Wow.
By no means am I suggesting not to be involved, because that's obviously a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But the data just kind of washed that one out. Also, what was interesting as well is ingratiation and self-promotion didn't matter.
Really?
So unlike previous research, that didn't matter, but etiquette did.
Wow. Very interesting.
So the take-home message here is as such. A number of things are predicting whether or not they get an offer or not. Etiquette comes into the mix. And the impact of etiquette was similar to GPA and the recreational activities. Of those items, though, it was the work experience that mattered most.
Yes. So work experience is important.
Obviously, the experience matters, but the other things do matter as
Also.
well.
So are you saying, should they put their GPA on their resume?
Well, that's an interesting discussion point. Traditionally, we've heard, put it on if it's above a 3.0.
Okay.
But now some recruiters are saying, put it on no matter what. Because if it isn't on the resume,
Resume.
recruiters are wondering,
what is your GPA? Why
You know,
aren't you putting it on?
What is your GPA? Okay. So now what they're saying is if it's at least a 2.5, put it on. And if it isn't on there, the students really should be prepared to discuss that during the interview. So we do have a question from Jose. He says, what do the asterisks represent? Jose, the asterisks represent which of those items predicted how many job offers they had. So etiquette mattered, work experience, GPA, and the recreational activities. The other ones without the asterisks did not predict.
Wow.
All right, so now let's move on to tattoos.
Tattoos.
Now, approximately 30% of Americans have at least a tattoo. And 75% of those with a tattoo have 2 or more. And about 30 or 40 years ago, it wasn't 30% of folks who had tattoos, it was 1%.
Wow.
And traditionally, those with tattoos belong to, specific groups, like military, bikers, gangs. It was really a little more fringe.
Okay.
Now things have moved into the mainstream. And it was in the late 1990s when there was this explosion of tattoos. And now with the millennials, they've become even more popular. And as we see them more and more, employers are wrestling with what do we do about this stuff? Because they're concerned, what their customers may think. And there generally is a negative tattoo bias. People tend to infer personality based on your tattoos. So if they do see a tattoo, they may think, uh-oh, that person may be, a little more deviant, and therefore I don't want to hire him or her. But as more and more people have tattoos, there may be less truth to that stereotype. There's this new movement out there that I found online. It's called Support Tattoos and Piercings at Work, which says, you know what, focus on my credentials and not my body art. So I was interested in, are employers still biased against those with tattoos? On one hand, you could say, you know what, given that they're more popular, there is no bias. At the same time, I don't think we have quite moved to that point where they're completely innocuous in terms of people's perceptions, particularly because tattoos tend to be more prevalent among younger individuals versus old. And the older folks are still in a position, of power in terms of interviewing.
Right.
So if you don't have a tattoo, you generally tend to be more biased against those, with tattoos.
Correct.
So I wanted to test this out. And how did I do it? I gave sampled recruiters 4 different scenarios. The scenario was of a candidate, Jordan, and I picked a name that was relevant for a male and a female. And the only thing that differed in the different scenarios was the picture. So different sets of recruiters had one of 4 photographs, and they had the exact same description of this candidate. And the description is of a candidate coming in for an interview. Generally speaking, the candidate was presented as possessing good credentials and exhibiting good etiquette. The only thing that differed was if the candidate was a male or female, and if they had a tattoo or not. So what I was trying to hone in on was, are they paying attention to what's on the forearm and the small tattoo on the neck? So they were presented with this scenario, and then afterwards they were asked a few questions about whether or not they thought this person would be a good fit for their organization, and whether or not they would extend an offer to him or her. Now, Maria, when you look at those different candidates, what are you thinking?
See, the tattoos really catches my eye because it's right on the neck, right on the arm. So I kind of feel like if I hire them, they'll be like those bad to the bone type of employees, you know?
All right. So let's see what the results say.
Okay.
All right. So we asked about person organization fit. To what extent would this individual fit in with the culture of your organization? And then we asked, would you provide, would you extend an offer to this individual? Regarding person organization fit, it did not matter if they had a tattoo or not.
That's great.
So that didn't come into play. But when it ultimately came to whether or not they would hire that individual, there was a negative effect for the tattoo. So Austin and Amy, if you had the tattoo, likely they would be biased against you. Fortunately, most of the students in the school, they know that there may be a negative tattoo bias, and those with tattoos, generally they're non-visible.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I've conducted other research, which I find interesting as well, because I was interested in whether or not there's any truth to the deviant stereotype. So I collected data on about 200 employees. I gave them a personality test, and I asked about their workplace deviance. And it turns out that those with a greater number of tattoos, they do tend to be a little more disagreeable, and they do tend to engage in more counterproductive behaviors at work.
Wow.
Now, the effect was not this big, it was about this big. And also I'd like to highlight as well that it just wasn't like one tattoo meant total deviance.
Right.
But on average, the more that you had, the more, quote, deviant your behavior was in the workplace. Now, it was only one study and much is to be done, but it does signal that there may be something below the surface level aesthetics. Now, employers ultimately have to decide, what is our policy regarding tattoos? I think it's good to be explicit because I think it's good to have uniform standards across, your organization. And there are pros and cons to it. You may not want to have tattoos in the workplace, but given that more and more people have them, you may be screening out some valuable folks. So that is it for the research component. Now I'd like to turn things over to Jason.
Mr. Biona, are you ready?
Okay, so we have 4 questions for Jason. Maria, would you first like to read these out, and then we'll have Jason
Sure. So what do you look for in a candidate, and how has it evolved over the past 10 years and 5 years? What challenges do you currently face hiring today? And what constitutes proper interview etiquette? How important is it? How important is it compared to the other credentials?
And also, Jason, I'd like to get your your thoughts on the research that I presented. Like, does it ring true, or were you thinking, you know what, Michael, that's a little bit of hooey? Because
I'll tackle that first because I'm actually really glad that you've done this research. I think to your point, I have the same dialogue and discussion with a lot of students. So to now have this research and the results, now we have something to kind of point to why students should listen to this message.
Okay, thanks.
So I'll tackle the first question, what I look for in a candidate and how is it involved. And I like this question because I always get asked over and over again what I look for in a candidate. Very rarely to never does anyone ask, how has it evolved over time? And for me, it really has evolved over time. So I would say I used to just look for raw top talent, and I looked for individuals that performed well in our company's internship program, or maybe performed well with another hotel or restaurant. But now I focus infinitely more on a good fit between a candidate's desire to work in a certain location or a department of a job that we have. So before, again, I would fight tooth and nail if we had a student that I built a great rapport with over many years and had done really good with us in our programs. But I found that over time, I would get emails and phone calls from these students that I maybe didn't put into the perfect fit, or I would hear from the hotels that they were moving on to other companies. So I learned that not all talented individuals can thrive in any environment, and that unfortunately, a second-tier candidate that wanted the job way more than the top-tier candidate was a better fit for our company in the long run. And so now I'm relentless on just trying to determine what a candidate truly wants, and then seeing if we have the opportunity or not.
Jason, I have a question. A lot of students ask me, how long do I need to stay in that first job? Traditionally we said, stay at least 6 months, stay a year. It seems like a lot of times they're accepting jobs that they may not fully like. And I want to give them some advice on how long should they expect to stay in a job in order to, do a good faith effort.
Great question. I would say they would want to make sure that they are aligned, because more than likely every company might have a different expectation. But if a lot of them are going into these training programs, what I often communicate is that for the company, we see these training programs as a sort of a staffing pipeline to bring in top talent. And if we're focused on training you in a certain function for 12 months or 12 to 18 months, we're looking for you to go into that function. And more often than not, students kind of will finish a program and say, I've been there, done that, now I want to change and do something different, which doesn't always make sense for the company. So I generally try and get candidates to try and stay in a certain geographic location and function for the first 2 years or so, and then let them know that, particularly at Marriott International, the world is their oyster, and once they get that good foundation and they've shined in that area, that they can move on to other departments, geographic locations they're excited about.
Jason, we have a question. When you talk about good fit, are you referring to their strengths, personality, or another trait? Can you hone a little bit in on that a tad?
Sure. I personally was referring to the fit of where they want to go geographically and what department they want to be in. Obviously, you can dig deeper. I just found when we try and look at the macro level, and I'm trying to fit students from 100 universities across a lot of our hotels across the country, it's hard to dig deeper than that. Even that third level of brand fit can be difficult because of the supply and demand challenge with what the students want to do and what jobs we have.
Okay.
Thank you.
So you want to address some of the
that
other...
actually will bring me to the next question. I know you asked what challenges that we currently face with hiring today. And plain and simple, for me, that's supply and demand. So believe it or not, there isn't a short supply of quality graduates out there so much as there's a short supply of quality graduates that want to do operations or do it in a certain brand or location that isn't their top couple of choices. So at Marriott, we've hired over 1,000 graduates into our global award-winning voyage program since it launched in 2013. 82% of those opportunities were in operations. And I wish I could tell you that 82% of our student population wanted operations, but the reality is somewhere close to that. Tell us they want sales, events, HR, some other support function. And the majority of them also talk about their desire to break into luxury when they graduate. And quite frankly, we just don't have enough of those opportunities to go around. I'd like to think we have more than our competition these days with the acquisition of Starwood. But ultimately, in summary, our challenges come down to finding top talent that are willing to be flexible on how they get their start and cut their teeth in this industry, which is exactly what we need.
So Jason, how do you try to attract them to operations? Because I know when I was an undergrad, it was the same thing. Like nobody wanted to go into operations. We thought, you know what? I've done operation, I've worked as a waiter, I've worked as a housekeeper, I don't want to do it now. So how do you frame it? Like, how do we get them in there?
Well, what we try and do is really just focus on who we're bringing to campus and what stories we're telling. Obviously, there may be some examples that are the anomaly where someone can break into sales or HR and the luxury right off the bat, but I can't scale that. And so we try and just make sure we promote the stories of people that got the operational foundation and how that made them a much better corporate associate one day, as the students have a lot of interest in breaking into corporate, or how that operational foundation made them a better sales leader down the road. We try and share those stories as often as possible.
I have a question from Austin Martini, Jason, and his question is actually for recruiters. He says that what emphasis do recruiters put on work-life balance as a recruiting tool, and how much value do they place on it in realistic sense?
I would say I'm a big fan of a realistic job preview, and if, at least for our industry, if we went around promoting work-life balance at the beginning of a career, we might not be representing that job that well. And so I personally have taken the approach at the beginning of my career that I wasn't necessarily going to focus on that. So later on in life, as I started a family, maybe I would have a personal brand built up within my organization where I could start to lead a little bit of a better example of having a work-life balance. But so Austin, what I would say is in the beginning of your career, we're not promoting that because it's not often going to be what your hiring managers and your leaders are looking for. And if they got where they are in a hotel without having tons of work-life balance, they might not be tapping you for that next opportunity if that's your focus right out of school.
I completely agree.
I always tell students that, in the early years of their career, pretty much work-life balance, there's not going to be a ton of it.
Right.
So, you just have to bite the bullet and work as hard as you can.
Yes.
That said, Jason, I'm wondering, are there any work-life balance initiatives, out there? I mean, do you find that people are saying, you know what, you're only going to work, let's say, 55 hours a week, or, you may get every other weekend off? Do you sense that people are trying to create a little more balance, or are they saying, bite the bullet, you're going to have to do whatever we want you to do? Does that make sense?
No, it does. And I would say the conversation has really been pressed, I think, by these differing points of the generations in the workplace. And I think it is a really interesting dialogue. I personally, when I worked in hotels, I saw leaders that they kind of valued the individual that was there and just putting in the time, even if the amount of time they put in wasn't as value added as someone that put in less hours. And so I spent my time trying to message, it should be more about the result. And if someone can come in and be inefficient for 40 hours, we should value that employee more than the one that takes 55 hours to do the same. But again, we're talking about leaders in the industry that have, as I mentioned earlier, got where they are today from a different way. And so I don't know that we've necessarily found the answer to that or closed that gap, but I think the conversations are picking up and different companies are looking at how they can kind of change the work environment in different pockets or pilots. And I think there's more to come.
All right. We have another question about realistic job previews. The question is, when do you give the realistic preview? Does it tend to be more in your marketing, materials? Are you giving it there? Or does it tend to occur more during the face-to-face interview?
I would say that personally, I've seen it more in the face-to-face interview and in the relationships that are built with our recruiters over the determine what it is the student's looking for and do we have that match.
All right. So now let's circle back to etiquette. Jason, from your perspective, what's most important, and then what are some of the knockout factors?
I want to hear this, Jason.
I would say everything that you covered today is a really good summary of interview etiquette, and I do think it's critical that students understand these tips. and that they practice them, because whether they like it or not, or whether I agree with some or all of these etiquette tips that were mentioned today, the fact of the matter is all recruiters are different, and they're more than likely not going to have an understanding of who they're interviewing with. What are the knockouts? And so they need to understand them all and come prepared to execute on all of them.
And one point that I try to communicate to students is, you know what, it's not going to hurt you to follow these things.
Yeah.
You know, nobody's going to be offended if you give them a business card. You know, nobody's going to be offended if you send a thank you note.
Right.
So
just do it.
Just do it. So try to adhere to these things. We had another point from one of our viewers. He said shaking hands properly at eye contact should have been rated much higher. And I agree. I mean, that handshake is so important, as well as that eye contact. And even though students know that the handshake is important, I find that probably like half the time when I shake hands with them, you know, they're still not doing it properly. They're lacking the web to web. You know, it's not firm enough. And sometimes they're not looking at you.
No, they're like,
you know, or down on the ground. And what's really interesting, you know, I have my Emily Post etiquette book here. They say that when you don't look at somebody in the eye, it's like a slap in the face. So we do have to practice, you know, eye contact. Obviously, you don't want to hold their gaze too long, but I think we could practice a little bit more.
I also like the Mr. and Mrs. That is very important to me. When I write an email, I don't know who that person is, but I always start with good afternoon, Miss. And, you know, when I see them face to face, they're younger than I am, then they say, hey, Maria, just call me this, you know, just call me Lisa, and it's not a big deal. And that's when I start calling them by their first name. But definitely important is calling them Mr. and Mrs., sir, doctor.
That's a really good point. I tell the students, use the formal title until instructed otherwise.
Right.
You know, if a student calls me Michael, it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I just kind of do a double take. You know, in a work context,
Dr. Toots.
You know, Dr. Toots. You know, like, you know, if I'm working with them as a TA after a while, I can say, hey, what, you know, call me Michael. So use the formal titles until instructed otherwise. All right, Jason, before we wrap things up, any parting thoughts? Any golden nuggets?
Golden nuggets? Chicken nuggets?
No, just, you know, kind of in summary, and then I would say that all these tips are important, but for me personally, as a talent acquisition professional, I'm more focused on that resume and making sure that they have a well-balanced kind of a show of their relevant work experience, an effort to give back to an organization or cause that's important to them in life, their academic success, their global perspective, and or maybe an ability to show an inclusive mindset. But although that's important to me, and I can kind of forgive an etiquette faux pas, again, I think that there are so many hiring managers that can't overcome some of those mistakes. So I want to say thank you for doing all this research and for starting to socialize it, because it is critical to help the students with their success.
And I'd like to highlight this one point. Like, we're not, you know, trying to suggest that etiquette, you know, is the end all be all, that it's the only thing that matters, but rather that it's one important part of, you know, the equation. So it's not, you know, not going to totally predict if you can do the job. Clearly, you have to have a passion for the company, possess the right qualifications, background experience, and personality. But, you know, etiquette is something that our students should be.
And it can be a deal breaker. It could knock out a certain candidate if you have two great candidates and you're trying to make a decision.
And I do think you bring up a good point as well, Jason. Sometimes you have recruiters who will focus perhaps a little too much on, let's say, etiquette or one thing. So it's good to, you know, probably have that, you know, well-balanced perspective. All right, gang. So that wraps up our webinar today. Well, we have one more question.
Yes, Chris. From a university recruiter's perspective, what number one skill is lacking from candidates, and how do you think educators can better train this skill? That's for Jason.
Well, it's tough for me to pinpoint one particular skill set, and I do think that when we look to define that, it's going to vary across all the different universities. But what I think is our joint responsibility is it's on the company too to make sure we're bringing individuals in and training them, so they don't have to come with all the skill sets. That's what I try and tell our hiring managers. That's the point of our training program. What the one thing I think our candidates and students are lacking is what I've already kind of alluded to earlier today. It's that flexibility. So it's less of a skill, and it's more of a flexibility of where they can get started as opposed to waiting and getting there over the course of time.
Well, thank you. So is that it? Do you guys have any questions out there for Dr. Tooze, for Jason, or even me? You can go right ahead and put your questions on the chat so we can read it. No questions?
All right, gang. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Jason.
For taking the time.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank all of you out there who participated in the research.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for all the support staff here in the school that helped us launch this first webinar. So enjoy your day.
Thank you to our industry partners. Thank you very much. And you guys have a good day. Bye.
Bye.